Hi, everyone. We're here with Graig Uens, Director of Planning at Batory Planning and Management. And we just want to dive into a little bit of what is the missing middle. Greg, good morning.
Hey Nate, thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks. So the point of this was to just give people who don't really know what's going on with the missing middle some insight to it. And I'm really pleased to have you sharing some time with us. Thanks, Greg.
Oh, my pleasure. I enjoy talking about this stuff, so happy to.
Nice. So yeah, I think a lot of people are just, what is the missing middle in your perspective, and what will this change for Toronto? I think it's very exciting.
Yeah, it's we're at a really interesting time, and I know missing middle has kind of been creeping its way into more mainstream conversations over the past couple of years, and I think that's great because I think it reflects a lot of evolution that's going to happen in the city over the next decade or 2 decades. And the way I look at missing middle, and you've got a nice diagram behind you that people like to put up, talk about missing middle. It's basically anything from that above a detached house, above a single unit house, and up to your characteristic mid-rise apartment building. So it's usually things like multiplex houses, duplexes, triplexes, sixplexes, garden suites and laneway suites fit in there, as well as like incremental forms of additional housing you can build on lots. It's various forms of townhouses, walk-up apartments, all sorts of ways to chop up and divide units, whether they're for rental or for ownership on one property. And that, once you get to around 4 stories, that's usually where missing middle tops out. And then you start getting into kind of different forms of construction and different types of buildings. But yeah, that spectrum that you see on the map behind you really illustrates it well. And yeah, that's missing middle housing.
Awesome. Um, you know, what was the process prior to these changes that, what was the missing middle for the average person? Major challenges.
Well, I mean, when we talk about it in the Toronto context,
Right.
the missing middle isn't exactly missing from Toronto. There's lots of it, especially in the older parts of the city. If you walk around many areas, you see triplexes, whether you know that they're triplexes or not. They might just have a couple extra mailboxes and doorbells. A lot of people have basement units. People have been starting to build laneway suites in the last couple of years, garden suites now. And there's walk-up apartments all over the place as well. Like, I live in an area where we've got a rooming house and 2 walk-up apartments, townhouses and singles all on the same street. And that just exists because it was built before we created rules that prevented people from doing that, which was several decades ago. And the city really grew, especially outward, as a result of those rules. And like, without going into too much detail, the city has this document called an official plan, and it lays out the policies for the entirety of the city, how we grow, where our roads are, what type of buildings get built where we have our parks and ravines and whatnot, and many other questions. And within that plan, it prioritizes the stability of the city's low-rise neighborhoods. And the way it does that is by making sure that whatever you build in neighborhoods looks like whatever's already there. And so for most of the city, it's detached houses, semi-detached houses. And the policies were so specific so as to prevent things like multiplex houses for a long time. And of course, you have zoning, which implements those policies, and that really allows what you can and can't do on your properties. So if you wanted to build a multiplex in a lot of the city of Toronto, up until this year, you couldn't do it. You'd have to go through a process, and a lot of times the city would say no, because this doesn't reflect what's in the neighborhood right now. It doesn't reflect the neighborhood character, which is a term that I hope is on its way out. And because it's exclusionary. And so what Toronto has been looking at over the past couple of years, and really I think it started in 2018 when laneway suites were approved. And that was something I worked on. It was a program called Changing Lanes. And that introduced new zoning permissions for anybody who had a property backed onto a public lane. If you had enough space, you could build a laneway suite. You didn't have to go through a process if you could build in accordance with the zoning. And we tried to make it as flexible as possible. When we wrote that bylaw, I remember saying to staff, I don't want to see any of these. I don't want them to come across planning's desk. I just want them to go get a building permit. Right. I don't have an interest in, nitpicking design aspects of somebody's laneway suite. Similar thing happened with garden suites a few years ago, and now we're seeing multiplexes as well. So the city keeps relaxing its zoning in these neighborhood areas, and the policies as well around this type of housing, and so you're seeing more of it get built. Since laneways have been around for a little, laneway suites have been around for a little longer. You walk around, you start seeing them, and what I've found really interesting, because I was at the city for, well, up until last fall. I would get a lot of calls on laneway housing because my name was on the laneway suite report. And people, for the first couple of years, people would be calling and they would say, "Hey, I heard you could build a laneway suite. Can you tell me about that?" Or my neighbor said you might be able to do this. And then, a year later, it was, "Hey, somebody's building one of these up the street from me. I want to build one too." And so we're kind of getting to that point where it's, people who don't follow planning policy or this kind of stuff are starting to see them and saying, "Hey, I could do that." And as a result, you're seeing more and more and more. Every single year since laneway suites were approved by council, we've had more building permits for them than the year prior. So it's going up, and it's going to plateau somewhere, but I don't know where. But it's that. So that's what's happening in Toronto right now. We had permissions for laneway suites. People are starting to build them. People are adapting the way they live to fit that into their plans for the future, how they set up a rental unit. Similar things happening with garden suites, and you're going to see it happen with multiplex now because the city just approved permissions for multiplexes with up to 4 units across the city, which is a huge change.
Yeah. Do you see that these changes could also save time and money for construction of this
Oh,
kind of
big
housing?
time.
Yeah.
Because before, if you wanted to attempt to do one of these in, say, a neighborhood in North York, good luck. You could apply, you could get your plans drawn up, and even if you were successful, you may have to go through a lengthy process to amend the zoning, to amend the official plan, and staff usually weren't supportive of that stuff at the city. But things have changed a lot, and it's been driven by the housing crisis and I think just evolution in people's sensibilities about how they live in the major city, which is cool to see. So yeah, and added to just the fact that you're able to do it is nice because certainty, of course, is valuable when you're approaching a
Yes.
project like this. The city also waives development charges for 4 units on these lots. So if you're building a fourplex, you don't pay development charges, which can get into the 6 figures very quickly, depending on the number of bedrooms you're putting in these suites. And so, and they also exempt them from parks levies, which, depending on the land value, can be quite high as well. So you have significant reduction in costs, more certainty, and a reduction in timelines to build these. If you own a large lot in North York, you can call up an architect today and say, "Hey, here's some criteria, design me a fourplex," and you can get your building permits in sometime in the summer.
Yeah, wow, that's way faster than what it used to be, and I think
Right.
it's very exciting. I think that maybe the time factor may have been holding back a lot of smaller builders or just property owners that have some vision.
Oh, big time. When we were at the city, one of the things that we did was we hired the Urban Land Institute to put together a table of construction experts, project managers, people who buy these type of sites and develop them and build this type of housing, to cost out, and architects as well, to put together a bunch of multiplex forms and to cost them out and to see where the cost constraints were, and whether that was driven by zoning or process or uh, fees and charges like development charges. So that was really helpful information to have. And the fact that the city's really tried to just step out of the way and let these get built, I think is great. And you're going to see them get built.
That's
I've
great.
already had a lot of calls about people
Awesome.
wanting to do multiplexes. It's really cool to see in areas where like it would not have been possible. It would have been unthinkable 3 or 4 years ago
Great.
to put
Yeah.
to put a fourplex in Highland Creek in Scarborough. Like,
Yeah.
get out of
Even
here.
even for myself, driving around the city and seeing what the potential was in a lot of these lots, and it's just all of these previous roadblocks were just like, oh, forget about it. Like, why even bother if you can't, turn it around in a decent amount of time and money. That's the
Yeah.
biggest thing stopping, I think, a lot of smaller builders from taking it on. So that's a good segue into who did the city have in mind when they approved these rules? Was it multi-gen families or small businesses? Who are they hoping to target?
I think it's it was a wide range of people. It was people who want to build these and create more rental housing stock in the city. It was people who own properties, and maybe you got a 3-story house and you're financially able to turn it into multiple units and you want to just live on one floor. Or maybe you want to build a garden suite in the back and build a multiplex in the front house, and that's your retirement. And maybe your kids live in one of the units.
Right.
So there's a multi-generational aspect to it. There's all sorts of things. Like when I was working at the city and I would get calls on laneway housing, I would sometimes ask people, just out of curiosity, what are you building it for? Because I was interested. And I got a wide range of stories from people. People wanted to build it for their kids, and sometimes their kids were like 5 years old, but they were going to rent it out for a few years. And then when their kids were old enough to want to be on their own and they didn't want them in the house, they'd move them into the garden suite, which I thought was kind of cool. And then when they're, eventually they plan to live in it themselves. So you kind of design it with that in mind. And I think the use of it is temporal. Like for a while, it's a rental unit, and then it becomes something that keeps somebody from having to go out and find another rental unit if it's your kid, right? And then maybe it's where you retire, and that allows you to do something in turn with the larger house. And so it just opens up a world of possibilities. And I believe that the city really wanted to create a framework that allowed for people that had different needs and they wanted to try out different approaches to this, that they could do so. Like I mean, one of the more interesting things I talked to somebody about, I was a couple, one of them called me and they were getting a divorce, but when they had kids, they didn't want to move apart for obvious reasons. So they could still see their kids. And one that was going to end up living in the garden suite or the laneway suite. The other was going to live in the main house. So there was some separation there, right?
The nicest doghouse in the neighborhood.
Right. So, and I look at some of these getting built, and there's some fantastic designs. There's like a little industry that's popped up around it. There's architects that have really started to specialize in these. There's builders that have started to, really focus on building these, and it's very cool.
Yeah, I'm looking to be a realtor that specializes in helping people put this together for them too.
There you go.
I think it's
I saw a laneway suite for sale that somebody obviously stratified.
yeah.
Um, Up just like Bathurst and Bloor area, I think. And I hadn't seen that too much looking on the MLS. It's like, oh, this is cool.
Right.
This is happening
Yeah.
now.
Yeah, I've seen some pre-sales and things like that of people trying to put together larger multiplexes as well too, in
Interesting.
Cabbagetown. Yeah. So, I guess when we talk about people, modifying their existing large homes and things like that, I think if I wonder if you agree that this could ultimately benefit the average person too, who's looking for housing as more and more of these units come online. Do you think something like costs and rents could start to, I guess, level off? I don't know if they'll ever go down, but maybe they'll won't keep skyrocketing up.
I hope so. That's, I think, the big reason that the city is doing this. And one of the reasons I think it's a great opportunity. Well, something we have to do in the city. There's clearly a lot of unmet demand for rental housing. Even the city estimates that there's going to be a lot of unmet demand for rental housing, especially low-rise rental housing going forward. There was a study that we did back in 2021, I believe, that you can find online, which it really highlights the fact that we have to build a lot more of this low-rise rental housing if we want to, meet that demand and hopefully keep some, downward pressure on prices from continuing to explode upward in the rental market. I like, why not have an abundance of housing? It's we've tried so many things to deal with the housing crisis.
Yeah,
How about housing abundance? Wouldn't that be great?
you're
I
right.
remember when I first moved to the city, like 12, 13 years ago or more,
Oh,
and it wasn't a problem finding. Like I was just starting my career in Toronto. I got like a one in den, and it was fine, and the rent was reasonable, and I could still have a good time. And I don't know how people are making it work today with the rents
yeah.
what they are versus what people make when they get out of school. It's crazy, and more opportunity, like more options, like great. We need to make better use of our housing stock. Detached houses are the least efficient way to house people in a city like Toronto. It just doesn't make a ton of sense, and especially around areas where we've got, like like I mentioned, Bloor and Bathurst.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
I worked on the Honest Ed's development there when I was at Toronto, and one of the things that people were concerned about, oh, it's going to really destabilize the neighborhood. Well, no, it's going to add a lot more rental housing that this area desperately
Right.
needs. I
Yeah.
should, I shouldn't be able to stand at the back of Bathurst subway station and, like throw a baseball and hit the back of somebody's detached house. It's kind of absurd, but you can do it, you know. It's a problem with land use, and it has to get fixed at some point. And the city is making, I think, really important gains in addressing that.
That's awesome. It's exciting. It's exciting to talk to someone else who's also excited about it. And I feel like it's been in the works for a long time. Um, has it's been a few years actually since this initiative started. And you know, once it got approved, was there any specific notable thing that would get this approved, or was it really just like a long kind of grind?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few things that contributed to it. There's and a lot of factors that are like things were just coming to a head in terms of the housing crisis. I think people that historically really didn't have all that much of an interest in seeing new rental housing, or were worried about housing generally, started to see their friends and younger family members get priced out of the city. Um, People want to see their grandkids. So like one of the things that we heard a lot is, my kids can't afford to live anywhere near us. They got to move 2 hours away to get a house. And so,
Mhm.
people who were older and were established and had a house in the city, like they're not going to see the grandkids as much. Is it worth it? Like what's the point? What's the point of having a $3 million house on the beach if your family can never visit you,
Right.
and
Yeah.
or sell them because of the distance. Like, and so there was that. There was um and I think internally in the planning department, there's a lot of changing minds in terms of like I can tell you the neighborhood stability and character policy situation was something that internally there was a lot of friction on. Like for years and years leading up to the missing middle stuff. Like I remember, I think it was like 2013. I got a call from somebody when I was working downtown, and they had this idea for a triplex in an area where you weren't allowed to build them. And it was a good design, and it made use of the existing building. And I thought to myself, man, this is actually great. I wish they could do this, but I got to tell them no, because there's really no path to say yes with the way the policies are written. And so I had to do that. And I still walk by that site sometimes, because it's not too far from where I live, and it's where I live now. And yeah, it's like, man, I wish I just said yes to that, but I couldn't. But now,
Now you can,
and
yeah.
now you can, and so there's been some evolution. It's taken a bit of time. There's a real political aspect to this as well,
Right.
and some of the issue is that in the core of the city, multiplexes and things, walk-up apartments and all that have been permitted in principle for a long time. It's the areas on the periphery of the city, the more suburban areas that developed in the 50s and 60s, that are very established single family areas where that's all you can build. And introducing multiplexes into those areas is going to be transformative. Even garden suites, they're hard to build downtown because the lots are a lot smaller. But when you get out into North York, Scarborough, and Etobicoke, you have some incredible opportunities to build very large functional garden suites that add more. Like, how hard is it to find ground related family size rental housing in a neighborhood in Toronto? Unless you can afford to rent an entire house, good luck.
It's tough. It's tough. As a realtor, I've done quite a few leases over the last few years, and I would say that over each year that goes on, it's actually been getting harder and harder. Um,
Yeah.
it's a little disheartening. It's kind of sad to see, but and it's a lot of hard work involved. I mean, for most it's possible, but there's also some that have slipped through the cracks as well too, and it's just unfortunate to um, go through that. You know,
Yeah, you want
it's
to when you broaden the spectrum of housing that's available to people, you don't like, because right now in a lot of the city, up until recently, and really going forward until this stuff gets built more frequently, you could either buy a detached house, rent a whole detached house, or maybe rent a basement apartment, and that may not. And no, those price points might not work for you. And the basement apartment, if you can afford to rent it, may not work for your family situation because maybe you got kids and it's like a 1 bedroom basement. And so a lot of people just don't have an option to get into the area. So the city initiative that started in 2020 was called Expanding Housing Options in Neighborhoods for that reason. And what that does is, I think, insert different levels of affordability via different types of more dense missing middle housing into areas of the city where they're currently absent. So I like whether it has an impact on rents overall or on in certain types of properties. I think that remains to be seen. But just by virtue of saying, like, you're a young professional couple and you've got a kid. Maybe you can't afford to buy or rent an entire house, and maybe the basement apartment isn't suitable. But can you rent a 2-bedroom laneway suite? That may be exactly the right fit. But they
Right.
didn't exist up until a few years ago.
Yeah.
So that's I think how the problem starts to get addressed. But there's other stuff the city has to do too. Like it doesn't end with missing middle housing. There's other
Right.
things, but we won't get into that because that's a fish.
No, that's fine. Do have another question though, segues into that. Um, if you could see, there's been so many changes already, but if you could see just one more thing change, what what would it be? What would it be?
Well, I gotta get kind of in the weeds here, but
Okay.
I would like staff to have delegated authority to make minor changes to the zoning bylaw at the city. Like let's say you have a site that is great for a multiplex, and because for one reason or another you need some variances, you have to go to the committee of adjustment. You've signed yourself up immediately for like a 6-month process. By the time you get your plans put together, submitted, you get a hearing date. Hopefully you get approved. If you don't, extend the process longer because you may appeal. Whether you're successful or not, who knows. And I think it's one of the remaining process obstructions. Like you might say, well, just make the zoning bylaw easier to comply with. Well, there's circumstances where no matter what you do with the zoning bylaw, there's always going to be sites that fall through the cracks. Like there's several 100,000 lots in Toronto to which the new garden suite and multiplex permissions apply.
Oh yeah,
And if you're never going to write a set of rules that fit all those lots
right.
perfectly, so I mean, some discretion on the side of city planning staff, so you can sit down and kind of negotiate with them and work with them. Say, hey, what if we do this? What if we do this? Does this work? Great, and you get a bit more certainty. And I think things would happen quicker, to be honest. But if the province were to delegate that authority to staff at the city, that would be great. The other thing, and maybe this is probably a less kind of in the weeds thing, the city should advertise it more. I wish the city would like say, hey, guess what you can build now? Hey, do you
Right.
own
Yeah.
a big detached house on a lot in the Etobicoke? Check it out. Here's what you can do. Go hire an architect. And it's just so that it's not that thing that I mentioned earlier with laneway suites where people are calling
Right.
the city like, hey, I heard a thing about this. Maybe I can do it. I don't know. Can you tell me more? There should be some kind of an ad campaign. I think the
Yeah.
return on that would
That's
be tremendous. If and I mean, I guess, and that's up to individuals like yourself to have clients who want to be kept in the loop on this stuff and know what's happening and know how to take advantage of it to do it on their properties. So
yeah, awesome. I really appreciate it. These are really good points, and thanks for the background as well too. I personally, I know going through all the PDFs on City of Toronto site that I imagined there was there was a lot more to it than just a 10-minute blurb on a half-hour interview like this. But I really appreciate your time, Greg.
oh, my pleasure. Hey,
Yeah.
if you didn't notice, I really enjoy talking about this stuff. So
Hey.
always happy to. And
Yeah.
yeah, I just, like I said, the more people that know about this, the better. The more people that understand what they can do to create more housing and to like suit their own lives better.
Right.
If
Yeah.
they got kids and they're worried about what they're going to do when they grow up and want to move out of the house, there are options here now that weren't here a year ago. So
Yeah.
it's good to know.
Incredible options actually that weren't
Yeah.
available a year ago. Yeah. I think it's very exciting. I want to keep the positivity going for Toronto. We have a similar story moving to Toronto to start our careers probably 12, 13 years ago. And yeah, I would really love to see that vibe come back. The Toronto of 12 years ago is not the way it is now. And, I think
Yeah.
a lot of it has to do with the people's lack of choice and lack of stability. And once we, hopefully this helps bring that back. And, you know, the Toronto that we miss comes back too, in a way.
I hear you.
Okay, Greg, I really appreciate it. I'm going to cut this off for now.